The topic of this presentation, namely the 30 million word gap, has been at the forefront of discussions about early education and child welfare in the United States for some time now, as you can see by the media headlines I've included on this slide. And so in this video, I'll speak a little bit about what exactly this gap is and why the 30 million number is significant. Uh, in the 1980s, Betty Hart and Todd Risley from the University of Kansas conducted what's now considered a classic longitudinal study with the aim of comparing how parents of different social classes talk with their children. And I should say too, this research is all going against the background of findings going back to the 50s and 60s that showed children from disadvantaged families were starting kindergarten with lower language and cognitive skills than those from more advantaged families. So essentially, Hart and Risley were interested in what was going on in the home that might be causing this. During the study, they observed and recorded everything that went on in the home of 42 families, ranging in terms of socioeconomic status levels, or SES, for 1 hour each month. And for each of the families, they began the study when the children were around 7 to 9 months of age and then followed them up until they were about 3 years old. Okay, so what did they find? Well, if we look at this chart, we can see trends that indicate huge differences among parents and children, even at age 3, across SES levels in vocabulary size and language use, that is, how many utterances and how many different words they speak per hour. So that's already pretty striking. But if we look at language experience represented as the number of words that children heard at home, the average child on welfare had half as much experience per hour as the average working class child, and less than one-third that of the average child in professional or high SES family. To get a true estimate of the children's language experience, Hart and Risley extrapolated this data to a 100-hour week, assuming 14-hour waking day, which shows the average child on welfare to have 62,000 words of language experience, the average child in a working class family to have about 125,000 words of experience, and the average child in a professional family to have about 215,000 words of experience. Extrapolated further to a year gives you these numbers, which if extrapolated even further shows that by age 4, the average child in a welfare family would have only accumulated a language experience um, with roughly 13 million words compared to the 45 million of their wealthier peers, hence the roughly 30 million word gap. And of course, as should be noted again, these are strictly estimates, and estimates which I should add that assume the earlier observational trends are held constant. But what's important for our present purposes is that these estimates, and more specifically the 30 million number, more or less provide us with the magnitude of the differences in children's cumulative language experience, which helps us illustrate how big the gap actually is. Um, so a question that typically comes up with respect to this work is why does the token number of words matter? Well, despite the phenomena being called the word gap, I don't think it's strictly speaking about the disparity in the number of words, right? So Hart and Risley's contribution was monumental in that it highlighted a difference in the language experience children were receiving at home, which then prompted others to look at what precisely the mediating factors between SES and children's language skills might be. So Erica Hoff at FAU, for one, ran statistical analyses on a database of coded transcripts from recorded interactions between high SES and mid SES mothers and their children in an effort to construct a mediation model that accounts for this relation between SES and, in this particular analysis, child vocabulary growth. Of course, in order to construct a mediation model for some two variables, say x and y, you need to first establish that x is significantly associated with y, and as we might expect based on Hart and Risley's findings we just reviewed, SES turned out to be a significant predictor of child vocabulary growth. But more interesting though, her findings showed that SES was a significant predictor of properties of maternal speech that make up children's language experience, in particular, mean length of utterance, or MLU, and the number of word types. And in turn, those properties of maternal speech emerged as significant predictors of child vocabulary growth. Uh, And as part of her effort to construct a mediation model, she was able to mark these properties as of maternal speech as being mediating factors, since once the variance attributable to them was removed, the association between SES and child vocabulary growth was reduced. In fact, after she removed the effects of maternal speech, the association between SES and child vocabulary growth is no longer significant, so it thus demonstrates a full mediation. Building on Hoff's findings, recent fMRI research from Romeo et al. In a 2018 paper demonstrated that one, quite similar to Hoff and Hart Risely, higher parental education and income factors that constitute SES are significantly correlated with more words spoken to children and, more interestingly, more conversational turns. So that is pairs of adult utterances followed by a child's utterance and vice versa. So they did this by putting these small recording devices in the pockets of 4-year-olds that automatically tracked all of the different speech properties um, that they were interested in, like those I just mentioned, and then later ran the stats on the data. And yeah. Uh, Two, they demonstrated that the number of conversational turns strongly predicted children's scores on standardized behavioral assessments that were given at the beginning of the study in order to characterize their verbal and nonverbal cognitive skills with respect to language. So, if we recall the model from Hoff, modifying it a bit so it's more fitting to our discussion, SES is a predictor of the quality of children's language experience, and the quality of children's language experience is a strong predictor of cognitive skills with respect to language. But most importantly, Romeo et al. Demonstrate three, um, children who experience more conversational turns with adults exhibited greater left inferior frontal gyrus or Broca's area activation during a storytelling fMRI task, which is widely understood as the site of languagey stuff in the brain. So basically, all they did for this part of the study was have those same 4-year-olds go into an fMRI machine and then passively listen to short, simple, 10-second familiar stories about people playing games, getting hurt, etc., and then recorded their brain responses as they were processing what was heard. But in any case, they found Broca's area activation on this task to be a mediating factor that accounts for the relation between the number of conversational turns and children's composite language score, which, as I mentioned, is just a measure of those series of behavioral assessments they gave at the beginning of the study. But overall, that's really fascinating. So, what should the main takeaways be up to this point? Well, all these different findings suggest that the gap representing socioeconomic disparities in early childhood language development is bigger and more important than we may have thought. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the gap also doesn't just start at age 3 or 4. In fact, relatively recent research from Anne Fernald in her lab at Stanford showed there to be stark socioeconomic differences in children's real-time processing as early as 18 months. Um, Another takeaway I think should be that cognitively, experience begets skill, and the quality of a child's language experience at home is not only an integral part of their language skills, but is also an integral part with respect to their cortical development, as demonstrated by Romeo et al. That said, the word gap, which I say with air quotes since it's not entirely about words, seems to be caused by socioeconomic disparities at the level of the quality of children's language experience in the home.